She moved closer, her eyes holding secrets I wasn't supposed to see, while her sister just smiled, silently daring me to notice. The first thing that struck me when I walked into the room was how ordinary it looked, yet somehow, nothing about it felt ordinary. The light spilling through the windows softened the edges of the furniture, the hum of conversation from the other side of the house blending into a comfortable, almost lazy rhythm. But my attention wasn't on the decor or the familiar clutter of his family home, it was on them. My friend's mom sat at the far end of the couch, a quiet gravity to her presence that made it impossible not to notice. She wasn't flashy, her blouse was simple, her jewelry minimal, but there was a poise in the way she carried herself, a gentle command of the space that was both calming and disarming. She laughed at something my friend said, a soft, warm sound that made the air between us feel just slightly heavier. Something in the curve of her smile, the way her shoulders relaxed when she leaned back, made my chest tighten in a way I didn't fully understand. Then there was her sister, sitting a little apart but not distant. She had this effortless way of observing, eyes flicking between the room's occupants and occasionally landing on me with a soft, knowing smile. It wasn't playful in the casual sense, it was layered, teasing in the quietest, most deliberate way. The kind of smile that makes you wonder if they're seeing something you're not ready to admit, or maybe something you can't yet name. I tried to focus on casual things, the hum of the fridge, the faint scent of vanilla and something woodsy in the air, but my senses kept circling back to them. The subtle shift of her hand as it rested briefly on the couch cushion, the small tilt of her head as she laughed. Even the way she crossed her legs, her foot brushing lightly against the rug, seemed intentional, though I wasn't sure whether it was meant for me or simply a matter of comfort. Every glance felt deliberate, but not obvious. There was an unspoken invitation in the way my friend's mom lingered in conversation, a subtle pull toward the space where I sat. Her sister's gaze, on the other hand, felt like a quiet confirmation, a silent challenge that made me conscious of my own movements. Each small gesture, the tilt of a shoulder, the brushing of hair behind an ear, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she exhaled, was like a signal I couldn't quite decode. I felt both out of place and oddly at home. Every time I looked at them, it was like trying to read a language I didn't yet understand, each micro-expression and subtle smile a word I was desperate to translate. The room was full of warmth and familiarity, yet beneath it, a tension hummed, soft, unspoken, but undeniably present. It was as if the air itself was waiting for me to notice, to respond, to somehow step into a rhythm I hadn't yet been invited to join. By the time the first awkward joke broke the quiet, I realized something. This evening wasn't going to be ordinary, and I wasn't going to leave unchanged. The simple act of arriving had already shifted everything, and I couldn't ignore it, no matter how much I wanted to act casual. It started with a simple shift. She moved just a little closer on the couch, nothing overt, nothing that could be called intentional in a way anyone else would notice. But to me, every inch mattered. The warmth from her presence edged into my space, subtle and undeniable, like sunlight spilling over a tablecloth. I could feel the quiet gravity of her attention, the way her body slightly leaned toward mine, just enough that I caught it in the corner of my eye. Her hand brushed past mine as she reached for a cup of tea, the contact fleeting but electric. Not a touch meant to startle, but one that lingered in my mind long after her hand had returned to her lap. I could smell the faint, comforting scent of her perfume, something floral and soft, grounding yet hypnotic. It wasn't just physical proximity, it was a presence that wrapped around me, warm and steady, like I had suddenly become part of her orbit. Her sister sat a little apart, but I could feel her gaze too, light and teasing, almost invisible yet impossible to ignore. Every now and then, her eyes met mine, a silent acknowledgement of what was happening. There was no judgment in the glance, just a quiet observation, like she understood the unspoken tension growing between us. The way she smiled, small, knowing, patient, added another layer to the room, an unspoken encouragement, like she was silently saying, It's okay to notice, it's okay to feel. As the conversation flowed, my awareness of every micro movement sharpened. The brush of her arm against the couch as she shifted, the way her shoulder tilted when she laughed at something trivial, it all pulled me in without demanding anything from me. I wanted to lean forward, to close the distance in the same subtle way, but there was hesitation, a line I didn't want to cross too soon. That hesitation, I realized, was part of the pull. Every pause, every glance, every small movement heightened the tension. I noticed the quiet elegance in her posture, the way she sat with poise yet relaxed, as if she were perfectly at ease in the moment but aware of its fragility. It made me hyper-aware of my own body, how I was leaning just enough toward her to feel connected but careful not to overstep. The air between us felt electric, charged with a warmth I couldn't define yet, a gentle but persistent invitation to simply exist in the same space, close enough to feel the heartbeat of someone I shouldn't, maybe, be drawn to. And then there was the moment when she laughed at something, just soft enough to be intimate, her hands still near mine. The sister's silent, approving smile flickered again in the corner of my eye, and for the briefest instant, it felt like the room had shrunk around the three of us. We weren't just in the same room anymore. We were in a smaller, private world where every movement, every glance, and every subtle gesture mattered. By the end of that evening, it was clear that proximity had shifted the unspoken dynamic between us. I wasn't just an observer anymore. I was a participant in a delicate rhythm of closeness, subtle touches, and quiet attention, an invisible thread tying us together, 1 inch at a time. And yet, despite the warmth, a careful distance remained, a tension suspended between curiosity and restraint, waiting for the next moment to deepen. The first real shared moment came quietly, almost imperceptibly. We laughed at something trivial, my friend said, and in that laughter, our proximity felt less accidental and more like a gentle acknowledgement of one another. Her hand brushed lightly against mine as she gestured, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through my chest. Not bold, not deliberate in a way that demanded attention, but enough that it lingered, echoing long after the gesture had ended. Her sister watched from a short distance, her smile soft and approving, like she was silently orchestrating the delicate rhythm of our interaction. It wasn't intrusive, it was grounding. The subtle interplay between them, the mother leaning closer, the sister observing with gentle amusement, made the space feel intimate without pressure. It was as though the room had folded into a private corner just for the three of us, where words and gestures carried more weight than usual. Conversation grew easier, flowing naturally from one topic to another. We shared small anecdotes about college, mutual friends, and the quiet frustrations of daily life. Every time I spoke, her attention remained focused, her eyes steady and warm, reflecting a depth I hadn't expected. When she laughed, it wasn't just sound, it was a vibration that seemed to settle into my bones, comforting and disarming all at once. I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn to the cadence of her voice, to the way her presence filled the space around me. There were moments of accidental closeness, too. Our knees brushed under the table, a fleeting spark of awareness, followed by that soft, knowing glance from her sister. The gesture wasn't shameful or awkward, it was shared, acknowledged, and gently celebrated in the unspoken language of subtle connection. Her hand occasionally rested near mine, and I caught myself savoring the faint warmth, the softness of her skin, the way her fingers twitched slightly when she laughed at something absurd. Time seemed to slow in these shared moments. I noticed the tilt of her head as she listened, the way her eyes lit up when she recalled a memory, the quiet vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. There was a rhythm to it, words, glances, touches, all forming a pattern I hadn't realized I was waiting for. Each movement, each laugh, each pause felt deliberate yet natural, as if the world had slowed down just enough for us to inhabit it fully. And then there was the silent acknowledgement of the sister's presence. She never intruded, never commented on our subtle interplay, but her quiet smiles and occasional glances made the dynamic feel safe. Her awareness added an extra layer of warmth, as if to say, you can notice, you can feel, and it's okay. That tiny affirmation made the closeness feel lighter, more comfortable, and infinitely more intoxicating. By the end of this unfolding hour, it was clear that these shared moments had done more than bring us physically closer, they had shifted the emotional landscape. I wasn't just noticing her anymore, I was participating in a delicate dance of attention, warmth, and subtle connection. Every laugh, every brush of a hand, every glance carried weight. And yet, the tension remained unspoken, simmering quietly beneath the surface, promising that the evening, and our connection, was only beginning. The first real shared moment came quietly, almost imperceptibly. We laughed at something trivial my friend said, and in that laughter, our proximity felt less accidental and more like a gentle acknowledgement of one another. Her hand brushed lightly against mine as she gestured, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through my chest. Not bold, not deliberate in a way that demanded attention, but enough that it lingered, echoing long after the gesture had ended. Her sister watched from a short distance, her smile soft and approving, like she was silently orchestrating the delicate rhythm of our interaction. It wasn't intrusive, it was grounding. The subtle interplay between them, the mother leaning closer, the sister observing with gentle amusement, made the space feel intimate without pressure. It was as though the room had folded into a private corner just for the three of us, where words and gestures carried more weight than usual. Conversation grew easier, flowing naturally from one topic to another. We shared small anecdotes about college, mutual friends, and the quiet frustrations of daily life. Every time I spoke, her attention remained focused, her eyes steady and warm, reflecting a depth I hadn't expected. When she laughed, it wasn't just sound, it was a vibration that seemed to settle into my bones, comforting and disarming all at once. I found myself leaning in slightly, drawn to the cadence of her voice, to the way her presence filled the space around me. There were moments of accidental closeness, too. Our knees brushed under the table, a fleeting spark of awareness, followed by that soft, knowing glance from her sister. The gesture wasn't shameful or awkward, it was shared, acknowledged, and gently celebrated in the unspoken language of subtle connection. Her hand occasionally rested near mine, and I caught myself savoring the faint warmth, the softness of her skin, the way her fingers twitched slightly when she laughed at something absurd. Time seemed to slow in these shared moments. I noticed the tilt of her head as she listened, the way her eyes lit up when she recalled a memory, the quiet vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. There was a rhythm to it, words, glances, touches, all forming a pattern I hadn't realized I was waiting for. Each movement, each laugh, each pause felt deliberate yet natural, as if the world had slowed down just enough for us to inhabit it fully. And then there was the silent acknowledgement of the sister's presence. She never intruded, never commented on our subtle interplay, but her quiet smiles and occasional glances made the dynamic feel safe. Her awareness added an extra layer of warmth, as if to say, you can notice, you can feel, and it's okay. That tiny affirmation made the closeness feel lighter, more comfortable, and infinitely more intoxicating. By the end of this unfolding hour, it was clear that these shared moments had done more than bring us physically closer, they had shifted the emotional landscape. I wasn't just noticing her anymore, I was participating in a delicate dance of attention, warmth, and subtle connection. Every laugh, every brush of a hand, every glance carried weight. And yet, the tension remained unspoken, simmering quietly beneath the surface, promising that the evening, and our connection, was only beginning. It started with a look. Not a look meant to be noticed, not the kind that calls attention to itself, but a fleeting glance that lingered just a moment too long. Her eyes met mine across the room, soft yet piercing, carrying a quiet curiosity and something else I couldn't name, something that made my chest tighten and my pulse quicken. For a second, I felt exposed, as if she could see the thoughts I didn't even want to admit to myself. Her sister's gaze followed moments later, calm and deliberate, like a silent observer who understood more than either of us. Her smile was quiet, knowing, almost conspiratorial, and it made me acutely aware of the space between us. The air felt charged with unspoken words, and every glance became a conversation in itself. There were no words yet, but each look carried a subtle language of interest, hesitation, and desire, drawing me deeper into the moment. As the evening wore on, the glances became a rhythm. When I laughed at a joke, her eyes would flicker toward me for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I would catch myself staring back, as if trying to decipher the meaning behind the expression. There was warmth in her gaze, a quiet playfulness, and an undercurrent of something more tender, more intimate. Every subtle shift, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, felt deliberate, though it was impossible to tell if it was intentional or simply natural. Her sister, meanwhile, maintained that same calm presence, occasionally meeting my eyes with a soft smile that felt like quiet encouragement. There was an odd reassurance in it, as if she silently sanctioned this unspoken connection. Her observation didn't intrude, it framed the tension in a safe, almost protective way. I realized I wasn't just noticing them separately. I was reading the triangle of attention they created, a delicate interplay that made every gesture, every movement, more intense. I became acutely aware of the small, almost imperceptible ways proximity amplified the tension. When her hand brushed her hair from her face, her eyes met mine for a second, and it felt like she had paused time just for that brief exchange. The warmth in her gaze contrasted sharply with the casual serenity she projected in her posture, making each glance a carefully weighted moment of intimacy. My mind raced, trying to interpret the signals: curiosity, attraction, comfort, caution. Maybe all of them at once. Every lingering glance drew me closer without a word. I felt the pull of her attention like gravity, subtle but inescapable. There was a thrill in the restraint, in the unsaid, in the fact that neither of us had to speak for the connection to be undeniable. Even her sister's occasional glance reinforced the intimacy, creating a space where acknowledgement and desire could coexist safely, without pressure, without haste. By the time the night deepened, the pattern was clear. These lingering glances were more than incidental. They were a bridge, a quiet invitation into something unspoken yet profoundly felt. I was awake to every nuance: the warmth of her eyes, the subtle play of her expressions, the reassurance in her sister's presence. Each moment reinforced a delicate tension, a slow-building anticipation that promised the evening, and the connection, was only beginning, and that whatever came next would be worth waiting for. The conversation shifted, subtly at first, like the tide inching closer to shore. The jokes and casual chatter gave way to quieter, more personal exchanges, stories of mistakes made and lessons learned, small confessions wrapped in laughter and reflection. I noticed the way her eyes softened as she spoke, how her voice carried a warmth that invited trust, that made it easy to share thoughts I usually kept tucked away. It was as if the room had shrunk again, compressing into a private sphere where words mattered more than volume, where gestures carried the weight of emotion. Her hand rested lightly near mine on the couch, a presence that wasn't forced or calculated, but comforting in its simplicity. Each accidental brush sent a flutter through my chest, a quiet acknowledgement of our closeness. I felt my body lean subtly toward her, drawn in by the gravity of her presence and the depth in her voice. She laughed softly at one of my anecdotes, and the sound was like a tether, pulling me further into the moment, into a space that felt intimate yet safe. The sister's quiet presence was a stabilizing force. She didn't interrupt or intrude, she simply observed with a gentle, approving smile. There was reassurance in that smile, a silent acknowledgement that the space we shared could exist without fear or embarrassment. It made the emotional intimacy feel lighter, freer, as if the unspoken understanding between the three of us allowed the tension to bloom without consequence. I found myself revealing things I hadn't intended to, small details about my day-to-day life, fleeting regrets, and hopes for the future. Each confession was met with a listening warmth, a soft nod, a thoughtful glance. Her eyes held no judgment, only an attentive curiosity that made me feel seen. In her gaze I sensed experience and wisdom, but also a quiet vulnerability, a willingness to let someone into her world, even just for a moment. The way she leaned forward slightly when she laughed at something I said, or tilted her head when listening, conveyed more than words ever could. It was an openness that invited honesty, that quietly reinforced the connection forming between us. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Minutes passed like hours, yet the atmosphere never felt rushed. Each pause, each shared look, each brush of her hand against the couch or mine carried weight, building a rhythm that was both delicate and powerful. Emotional intimacy wasn't loud or dramatic here. It was a quiet, steady presence, the kind that seeps into your bones and lingers after the words have stopped. By the end of the conversation, it was clear that the closeness between us had deepened. The touches, the shared glances, the comfort of vulnerability, they weren't just fleeting sparks. They were markers of a connection that was growing slowly, deliberately, with respect and awareness. Her sister's subtle acknowledgement from across the room only reinforced the safety of it all. I felt drawn to both of them, yes, but more importantly, I felt invited into a space where emotional intimacy could flourish, a space that promised understanding, warmth, and something quietly profound. The evening had settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind of stillness that makes even small gestures feel amplified. It was in one of those moments, when laughter had softened and conversation had slowed, that I noticed the subtle shift in her demeanor, a fleeting vulnerability that made her seem even more human, more present. Her posture softened, her shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested she was letting down her guard just slightly, letting me see beyond the composed, confident exterior she usually carried. Her eyes, when they met mine, held something tender, a trace of longing perhaps, or maybe just the weight of a thought she hadn't shared aloud. It wasn't dramatic or demanding, it was quiet, understated, and profoundly intimate. I felt the pull immediately, the kind of tension that doesn't require words to convey meaning. Every subtle movement, the way her fingers lingered on her cup, the tilt of her head, the gentle sigh that escaped when she laughed quietly at something I said, added layers to the unspoken connection forming between us. Her sister, still nearby, remained an unspoken guardian of the space, her presence calm and reassuring. The soft, knowing smile she offered now and then made it clear that the vulnerability unfolding wasn't a mistake, wasn't something to be rushed or judged. It was simply another layer of the human connection growing quietly, carefully, in the shared space between us. That silent acknowledgement made the moment feel safe, almost sacred, a small pocket of intimacy that existed outside of any expectation or social rule. I became hyper-aware of the subtleties, the faint tremor in her fingers as she reached for her drink, the way her gaze briefly faltered before returning to mine, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she exhaled softly. Every movement, no matter how slight, carried meaning. I felt a deepening desire not for possession or overt closeness, but to meet her there, in that vulnerability, to offer understanding and attentiveness. Her laughter, now quieter and more reflective, felt like an invitation into a space of shared emotional honesty. I noticed how her lips curved in a gentle, almost shy smile, and the warmth in her eyes made me acutely aware of the fragile beauty of the moment. The subtle brush of her hand against the couch again, so slight yet deliberate, felt like an acknowledgement of the connection, a silent permission to exist closer, emotionally if not physically. And yet, despite the tenderness, there was restraint. The vulnerability was quiet, delicate, like a candle flickering in a gentle breeze, present, alive, but requiring careful attention. I found myself leaning in slightly, not to intrude, but to mirror the openness she was offering. There was a dialogue happening entirely without words, a shared understanding that we could explore closeness carefully, thoughtfully, without rushing or forcing it. By the time the evening edged toward its close, the quiet vulnerability had left its mark. It wasn't a dramatic confession or an explosive revelation. It was a soft, profound awareness that beneath the confidence, beneath the poise, there was a person willing to be seen. And in that, I felt a deep emotional connection, one that resonated more than words ever could, leaving me with a sense of warmth, intimacy, and anticipation for what the next shared moment might bring. By the time the evening drew to a close, the room had settled into a gentle, almost contemplative quiet. The subtle tension that had threaded through the night, the unspoken glances, the light touches, the soft laughter, had transformed into something warmer, more grounded. It was no longer about anticipation or curiosity. It was about connection, shared in a way that felt safe, intimate, and profoundly human. Her hand rested near mine on the couch one last time, and this time, I didn't flinch. The warmth was comforting, steady, and I noticed it fully, allowing myself to savor the subtle pulse of life in that small, shared space. There was no urgency in her touch, no pressure, only the quiet acknowledgement that we had been present with each other, fully and sincerely. The weight of the day, the moments of hesitation and longing, seemed to settle gently between us, leaving a calm sense of completion. Her sister, still nearby, offered one final soft, approving smile. It was a small gesture, but it carried immense reassurance, a silent confirmation that the moments we had shared were understood, acknowledged, and cherished. I realized that her presence, once an external observer, had become an essential part of the emotional landscape, framing the warmth of the connection in a gentle, unspoken embrace. It was a reminder that intimacy could be shared without words, that connection didn't always need to be loud or explicit. It could exist quietly, in glances, in gestures, in the lingering presence of someone who cares. I noticed the details more clearly now, the subtle curve of her lips as she laughed one last time, the way her eyes softened in reflection, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she settled into the couch. Even the faint scent of her perfume seemed more pronounced, comforting and familiar, a gentle reminder of the human closeness we had cultivated over the course of the evening. It was a presence I wanted to hold on to, not possessively, but with the quiet reverence of someone who had glimpsed a rare, unguarded truth. There was a calmness in the room that hadn't existed before. The earlier tension, the undercurrent of curiosity and subtle desire, had matured into something more profound, a gentle, steady warmth that wrapped around all three of us. I realized that what had begun as fleeting touches and lingering glances had grown into genuine emotional intimacy, a connection that was both shared and personal, delicate yet undeniable. As we stood to leave, there was no rush, no sudden movement to break the spell of the evening. The shared smiles, the small gestures of farewell, carried the weight of understanding and mutual respect. Her sister's eyes met mine one last time, full of quiet encouragement, while her own gaze lingered just long enough for me to feel the depth of our shared moments. There was a sense of closure, but also a promise, soft, unspoken, that the connection we had nurtured tonight would continue, in memory and perhaps in future moments yet to come. Walking away, I felt a profound warmth lingering within me. The evening had shifted something intangible, leaving a sense of completeness that didn't need words to be understood. It was a slow, deliberate journey from curiosity to closeness, from tension to tenderness, and as I carried the memory with me, I realized that the warmth, the quiet intimacy, and the human connection we had shared would stay with me far longer than the night itself.